Hello, everybody. Welcome to Geeks Not Nerds Live. Captain Logan is not here tonight. He is actually out of town and won't be making in time, so it's just the three of us running things. First up, we've got Rasco.
Howdy, everybody.
And we've got Manos, who jumped in as soon as we started the show. If you can hear us. We can't hear him, though.
Oh, okay, Google. This is how it's gonna be.
Yeah. Oh, well. Okay, well, we'll hopefully see if Manos can stick around or not, because we can't hear him for some reason. Anyway, today we are talking about a topic that we got from Rodrigo A. Arauz. The topic is, what are some adaptations that you guys think improve on source material? It can be anything: books, movies, comics, theater, etc. So we're going to generalize it a little bit and just say, like, adaptation versus source material, when it's good to change things, when you shouldn't change things, and some of our favorite cases where something was changed and we think it's for the better. Raska, do you want to go ahead and open with this? It'd be fun. Actually, maybe this is how we should talk about this. Raska, what is one thing you think is definitively better than the source material, and what do you think about source material versus adaptations in general?
I would say that the movie Jaws is definitively better than the book that it's based off of. I actually don't remember what the name of the book Jaws is based off of is, but I know I've read it. And wait, what was the second part to your question? Because I just completely blacked out the second part.
Okay, the first part was just what's definitively better, and what do you think about adaptation versus source material in general?
Okay, so like I said, my example of like a definitively better adaptation would be Jaws. And the thing is, with adaptation, it's kind of weird because you hear people talk about like, oh, the book was always better than the movie. And that's typically true when a movie tries to very closely adapt a book rather than like taking the essence and then doing something new with it. Because I am a big fan of the idea that like the medium that you choose to tell a story in is almost always going to be the definitively best way for that story to be told. So like if you make a movie, the novelization is probably not going to be as good as the movie, or the book is probably going to be better than the movie based off the book. But that only holds true when you're adapting it like a Harry Potter book to screen. I don't think that's the case when you take something like Blade Runner or like Jaws or like Jurassic Park, and you take a book and then you just pretty much take either the premise or just an idea, and then you use some of that stuff, but you make something new with it. Because at that point, you're not trying to adapt a story that was tailored to be told in a specific medium. You're trying to retailor it to fit in a new medium.
That opens up an interesting can of worms, too, because now we've got a lot of books, and specifically comics, that are written solely for the purpose of being optioned for movies. We've seen Kirkman do this a lot now. Ever since Walking Dead hit big, he keeps putting out things and keeps trying to get like TV and movie deals. And Mark Millar does exactly the same thing, and it drives me nuts. And then, of course, there are like all these young adult novels that are basically just being published to cash in on like the Harry Potter Twilight era of adapting everything in sight, which makes you wonder why even write these books in the first place if you don't want them to be actual novels. Jaws is a good example, though. I completely forgot that it was based on a book, but you're right. It's almost eclipsed the book now. Like, I bet most people will tell you Jaws is an original work, and it's not.
Yeah.
For me, something that's definitively better than the source material, I'll probably get crapped for this because I know a lot of people like the source material more, but I think Full Metal Alchemist, the original anime, is much better than the manga, and I think the manga adaptation they made with Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is not very good because I don't think the manga story is very good. Full Metal Alchemist is the perfect example of a person having lots of really good ideas for a story, and when they go to adapt it, we just cherry pick the ideas that work and flesh other things out. Other stuff that have done this is basically like Under the Red Hood, the movie versus the comic, or anytime we adapt basically any sort of comic book story for a film and we just attach the name of the story on there, we take all the interesting ideas of that story and then like flesh out little things in between and make it a different thing, but thematically keep the core there. Full Metal Alchemist, the anime, definitely does that, where it takes everything about that concept of alchemy and about the characters and about their histories, and it turns it into something that I think is a genuine masterpiece. And then you go back and read the manga, and then you go back and watch Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and I think it's just, I think there are lots of like bad contrivances and stuff in there, and I think there's lots of like, clearly this was a first draft, and the first anime adaptation is the better second draft. But as far as like adaptation versus source material in general, I think adaptations can always work. I don't really have any sort of problem with taking something that was in one medium and putting it into the next, if you have a point, if you have a purpose. If you're just going to take a book that's popular and turn it into a movie, that's maybe not the right way to do it. But you can take certain things, like the book American Psycho. American Psycho the book and American Psycho the movie are pretty similar, but I think it works better as a movie because some of the techniques that they use in the book, which is basically like, we go through the morning routine of Patrick Bateman. And so we've got like 5 pages of just listing out all the products he uses. And the point of the book to do that is to try and make you understand like just how materialized this whole thing is. And it's interesting, but it's annoying to read. And in a movie, you can do all of that in like a couple shots. And so in that place, I think like that's where sometimes the transfer from one medium to the other makes certain ideas work more.
Yeah, oftentimes you'll see when there's like a really competent movie adaptation of a book, oftentimes it like streamlines something. So that's the case of what Jaws does. What Jaws does is it streamlines that story and gets rid of a lot of excess stuff that really only holds, that would only really add to a longer runtime, but at the end doesn't add to the experience. So like, for example, like Hooper in Jaws has like a fling with Chief Brody's wife. And you're like, what does this have to do with the main idea of this story and the events that are taking place with this shark and this island and the effects of like people being afraid of the water and stuff like that? Like that stuff is what you're there for. And you don't necessarily need stuff like that because it wasn't like that added anything to his character other than maybe a little bit of a morally ambiguous side. And by the end, those issues aren't resolved really. So oftentimes, and that happens with other movie adaptations as well. So like the second Hunger Games movie, Catching Fire, the second book has all of this stuff with like Katniss and Gale and like this like romance thing that they're kind of having, but kind of can't have at the same time. And like, it's this really weird thing. And it's just completely not like their relationship, but I think there's this whole like subplot with them like actually trying to embrace their relationship between each other, and like that's just gone in the movie, and like that's there in the book. So like oftentimes not only does like that's something that makes sense to take out for making a movie because that's something you don't need, but it's also possible that the movie is better or the overall narrative is better without that stuff than with it, and you wouldn't know otherwise unless you did an adaptation.
That's a good point, especially with Hunger Games, because I think Hunger Games, I think every movie for that franchise is better than every book in that franchise. I think the 2-part last movie, I think is both parts of it are pretty bad, but the book is just awful. And the first movie is pretty good, the book not so much, and then the second movie I think is legitimately a good film, and the book not so much either. So that's definitely a good example, and that's something that I think was just clearly that author was trying to go for like tense action in a way that you can only really capture with like a storyboard or a sequence. Like it didn't feel like something that needed to be a book. It's this thing where like if you're gonna write something, you're gonna have to justify why you're doing it in this way. When you look at like something like Kevin Smith writing Daredevil, Guardian Devil, he doesn't know how to write comics, or at that point he didn't know how to write comics. But when he was doing that, Joe Quesada told him, just write this like a movie screenplay and we'll go from there. And so Guardian Devil's a really good story, but the problem is Kevin Smith at that point didn't know how to write a comic. And so Guardian Devil, in my mind, will always make a better movie or a TV arc before it's going to make a great comic, even though it is a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, it's important to point out that sometimes when they streamline something from a book to a movie, sometimes they cut out things that you shouldn't cut out or that like make the story worse. So like that's the case with Harry Potter 3. It cuts out like the Quidditch like House Cup when like Gryffindor wins that. And that's like one of the biggest, most important things in the third Harry Potter book is that like to cast a Patronum, you have to have like an incredibly happy memory that you can reflect upon in order to do that. And then they cut out Harry's memory that he uses to cast a Patronum, which is like winning the Quidditch House Cup. He's like, and in the ending of that chapter of the book, it says like Harry felt as if he could cast like a million Patronuses, or I don't know what the word is, but something like that. And then at the end of the book, he like, and in the movie, he like is able to go like expecto Patronum, and like that chapter of the book is just not in the movie. And that's a case where like they streamline things that were important.
See, that's interesting because you're right, but Prisoner of Azkaban is still my favorite Harry Potter movie. I still think it's...
Yeah, and a lot of people say that, but that's why it irks me, is because they took that out.
No, that's totally fair. That makes a good point. Another good thing we might want to bring up, because I have this whole point about comic books in particular that I want to get your thoughts on in a minute, but one specific thing I want to mention is The Mask. If you've read those comics, they're not terrible, but they're not very good, and they're extremely random and overly zany in ways it doesn't need to be. They're kind of disturbing and dark, and they try to be like kooky fun. They try to be like what Grant Morrison Animal Man is, which is basically, oh, look at how Looney Tune physics is just really horrifying. But the book never handles that well, and it also doesn't help that Grant Morrison does everything better. But then you look at Mask the movie, and it's almost unrecognizable from the comic, but so many people think The Mask is just a Jim Carrey movie. And everyone now just runs with that idea of what The Mask is as opposed to the comics. And that's one of those cases where the source material has been eclipsed by a superior adaptation.
Yeah. The Mask, that's a clear example. One example also would be like the movie Stand By Me.
I've never seen that, actually.
That's based off of like the Stephen King book, The Body. I think it's a Stephen King book. I'm not sure. It's based on a story called The Body. And then that's a movie where like no one knows about that. That's like a movie everyone's like, oh, that's such a classic movie. And it's like, that's based on something else. And like, it's really strange because like this happens a lot of times with classics. So one of the weird things about Hollywood is that we think of the originality period in filmmaking really wasn't the golden age of Hollywood. It came after the golden age, and like what people consider to be like one of the worst times for movies was like the 80s and the 70s. But that's when a lot of like the original kind of movies like Terminator, Alien, stuff like that, Star Wars, that's when that stuff came out. The classic era of Hollywood was book adaptations. It was like Frankenstein. It was like the Sound of Music. That's not a book adaptation, isn't it? Yeah, no, but it's still an adaptation. So then there's also like Pride and Prejudice, stuff like that. There's this like weird golden age of Hollywood. And a Blade Runner is an example of like, that's a movie that's based off of a book, but it's very kind of like loosely based off of it. And we consider these movies like the classics, but like we also consider them to be like the original, like, oh, that was when Hollywood was original. But that really didn't come until like much after the golden age of Hollywood, where we stopped adapting classic stories already and we started coming up with new stories. Yeah. And then we kind of like gone back to we've gone back to just adapting things now.
Yeah. And I like that you mentioned Blade Runner, because I think that leads into another point where like the adaptation is very different and it's really good, but in a lot of ways it can be equally good as the thing it's adapting. So like Durandra's Dream of Electric Sheep is a really, really great book. And the movie changes a lot of that, but I would never put it under the book, and I would never really put it over the book either. It's kind of the same thing with, I don't really care for the Fight Club book, and I love the Fight Club movie, but I think in a lot of ways you can make the case that they're both equally good. And it's one of those things where like the adaptation is trying very hard to not just be like scene for scene storyboarding the book, and with certain things you kind of want that. And in certain things, you don't want to make a Watchmen movie that is just a different concept, or else it sort of defeats the purpose. And so you have things like Durandra's Dream of Electric Sheep, which people do consider to be a classic, but there's only so much in that book that's ripe for visual storytelling, and so it has to be different. But because it's put under a little bit of that restriction, it makes it more unique and it makes it better. One of the things that everyone remembers of Blade Runner, whether or not they like that film, is how visually distinct it is. And with the book, a lot of things that people remember is just how linguistically it's very different than what most people understand as sci-fi. And so I think that's a really good way of like making a case for your adaptation.
Yeah. What about a movie like I, Robot? Because
Oh yeah, I
that's
Robot.
kind of doing your own thing with it too much to an extent. Where like
That's the thing with Asimov in general, though, right? Like I feel like every adaptation of Asimov has kind of been like, you should have just done the book.
yeah, like that's a strange one where it feels like there was an easy chance to make an action movie and then like code it with some sort of like deeper thematic depth that's not really there, but it's actually really interesting stuff that comes from a really interesting source, but it's kind of like the trappings and like just the really like superficial aspects of like interesting ideas. They're not really like the movie doesn't really explore that. It's kind of just like an action movie.
Yeah, and I, Robot, if I remember right, was sold more as kind of like an action horror movie. If I remember like the trailers when they were coming out, they would show those robots as almost being like horror movie type creatures that were after Will Smith. And then when I went and saw the movie, it was definitely more of an action thing. So that's kind of disappointing. And I think that's more of a case of just like the movie didn't really understand what it wanted to be either. Like it seems very clear that they just kind of went with a premise and didn't really understand what the story would call for.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like an easy chance to like add some validity to this weird kind of like futuristic world. It's like, oh, but it's based on these ideas and this stuff from this book. But it doesn't necessarily have to actually understand those ideas of the book.
Yeah. Another thing I want to mention while we're on this is that I think there were some cases where a thing fits in a franchise and it doesn't have to be bound by the continuity of the franchise or need to necessarily adapt anything about the franchise. I think with something like Transformers, for example, there's never going to be a reason to stay true to G1. I don't think if you're going to make a Transformers comic or a movie or a TV series or whatever, the only way you can really do that is to just do your own thing with the mythology that's already there from G1 and build your own stuff. There's never a reason to be like, okay, I want to scene for scene adapt the G1 cartoon. Yeah. Or I want to scene for scene adapt like the original Simon Furman Transformers UK comics. And I think comics in general operate the same way because they've been around for decades and decades and decades now. We've gotten to this point where even comics don't really care about comic continuity. So if you're going to make a movie based on a comic book, I think the only thing you should, as a rule, stick to is the name. I think you can make a Batman movie about anything as long as you call it Batman and then just make a case for it. But there was a little bit of discussion in the chat about this earlier, but like how ingrained is this concept of Batman doesn't kill to the character and how important is that to represent it into other things? And my answer to that is just, it's never important. If you want to make a Batman that kills, do it and make it part of your story or make it part of your character. If you don't want a Batman that kills, then don't do it. It doesn't have to be like this weird absolute universal trait for the character.
Yeah. Like it doesn't have to be what you want necessarily. I mean, there are tons of people that feel that way about like the Burton films. A lot of people like those movies, but would prefer, there's a lot of people that like the Burton films. And because of the context of when they're released, they don't necessarily have an issue with Batman killing because that's an early adaptation. And for an early adaptation, that's pretty visually what you would want for Batman, a lot of people would say. So like and also like context matters too. Like when we get into a world now where like you can do things and you can adapt things that you never thought, like Days of Future Past, stuff like that. You can adapt things that no one ever thought we would see being adapted. It's okay to change those up a little bit more. Because it's like, well, at least we're even getting this. Like, this is crazy that this is even happening. Somebody in the comments earlier wanted us to talk about like the Mandarin in Iron Man 3.
Yeah, that's a really good example because I've seen people, especially when the movie first came out, go on these tirades about how Iron Man 3, regardless of its quality as a film, betrays the concept of the Mandarin, and people were really sour to this idea of, oh, great, now we can't have the Mandarin, we can't have the genuine Mandarin in a Marvel Cinematic Universe film fighting Iron Man. And to those people, I submit, okay, I have read pretty much every Iron Man comic ever, and the Mandarin shows up with like 3 big stories. There are maybe 3 or 4 stories where he's a big, legitimate threat. And in every single one of those, he's a different character. And in every subsequent appearance in between those stories, just little stuff, he's a different character. So even in the comics, there's no kind of de facto idea of who the Mandarin is to adapt in the first place. So if you're going to use Mandarin in an adaptation, I don't think you're ever under any obligation to make him like the comics, mostly because there's nothing to latch onto. What are you going to do? You want to adapt the Mandarin, and the only things you can really go to are like Hands of the Mandarin, Revenge of the Mandarin, Rings of the Mandarin. I don't know. And they're all different characters. They're all different versions. There's nothing there that counts as like a concrete essence to that character.
Yeah, it also what's different about the Mandarin twist is that like if you are looking at a movie in a very face level value like type thing, and you're not really like trying to analyze it on any sort of like thematic level, that you can say, oh my God, that was just a stupid gut punch twist. But that twist has everything to do with a lot of the ideas of that movie, with like this idea of like, and it's hard to like, that's a kind of political message in that movie. So it's kind of hard to not like get somewhat political when you talk about that. But it was kind of like this, like he made this caricature of what everyone's afraid of, and this Mandarin, this terrorist guy. And then in the end, it's a flip thing. And it's like, oh my God, they used this paranoia of terrorism against him in a way, or like against the US in a way. And like, that was kind of one of the ideas of that movie. That was part of the villain plot and everything. So like, that's a twist where it's like, if you don't have that, I think the movie's worse. Like, I don't think you can do that story. And once I've seen that, how do you not do that? Like, that's such a good idea, at least in my opinion. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree. And it may be that you really just wanted to see Mandarin on screen, and that's okay. But that's also like a personal thing. Like, that's not like a codified, like, this is a bad thing because it broke the source material. That's not a good enough reason for why something doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, the nature of adaptation is a difference, right? Like, adaptation is a word that literally means you're translating one thing to another. Things get lost in translation. Some things have to evolve, some things have to change. I dare you to find me any person on the planet that thinks original comic book Blade is cooler than Wesley Snipes' Blade. I don't think those people exist. I don't think those people have ever existed. And it's all because you're translating something and you're doing something different with it, and there is a reason for that. And if you can justify it and put it in the public consciousness long enough, then it works. Batman's no-kill rule, for example, is something that permeates for a while, but at the same time, in every live-action adaptation of Batman, he has killed people. There are multiple instances in every animated adaptation of Batman where, even if it's not explicitly stated, he probably killed a person. So it's a very different thing to ascribe traits that are just what people are comfortable with as being something that's absolute to the material. If you want, it's very different than something like Watchmen, which is a work that's designed to be taken on a very meta, very independent level. And so changing that, you are effectively changing the essence of Watchmen. I don't think it's true that way with comic book characters. Remember that Batman's no-kill rule wasn't designed as this is who that character is now. It happened because an editor is like, well, you probably shouldn't have this dude murder people when there's a kid around. Like, it's not a creative choice. It's just circumstance that evolved the character, and circumstance will continue to evolve the character as time goes on. And so if you're going to adapt something, then your personal preferences don't really factor into it. But I think there can be a case made of like an adaptation changed something and now the material doesn't work. And so you can make a case where like, well, if you just stick to what it was, maybe it could have been better. I think people make that argument for like a lot of really bad comic book movies like Elektra and the Catwoman and stuff. It's like just like, well, you change things, but if you just made a Catwoman or Elektra movie based on the comics, it probably would have turned out better.
Yeah, and sometimes I can get with that, but like Catwoman, okay, even if you have like Batman in that movie and all of this kind of stuff, and you make it like set in Gotham, stuff like that, like what you're saying is definitely true. Oftentimes, like a lot of the issues with something could have been just fixed if they had just done the more interesting thing that was in the comics or the original version. But
yeah.
it's sometimes it's like Catwoman was unsalvageable. Like whoever wrote that script, that was a terrible script. It was incredibly pandering. It was I don't know, it's just I don't know, offensive in certain ways depending on who you are. And it's just like a poorly directed movie for the most part. So like that's an issue where like yeah, it probably would have been slightly better, but that movie still probably would have sucked.
Yeah, that's fair. Catwoman was just that movie was a lie to begin with. If you watch the commentary Duke and Captain Logan did on it, the opening has based on characters created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, and Duke is like the biggest lie in cinema history. It's very true there. But no, you're right. Like there are some things that are just like, if you don't have the right people behind it, then it doesn't really matter. You could have taken the concept of the Catwoman movie and given it to someone like, I don't know, Shane Black or Joss Whedon or something, and they would have made it into a good movie. So it really just depends on like whose hands it's in. Even with something like BVS, like everyone knows I hate Batman versus Superman. I think it's the worst comic movie ever made, all that stuff. But there are things about it that are intentionally different, that are trying to be something else. And I think you could have done something legitimately great with it as is. If I don't really have a problem with murderous, wreck everything in sight, Kingdom Come Batman, if it's handled well, if there is a point being made with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it also comes down to like the like again, that comes back to the idea that it's like no, like if you don't like BVS and you don't like Batman in that movie, if your answer is just Batman kills, I don't like my Batman to kill, well, that's a reason why you may not like it, but that's not a reason why it necessarily doesn't work on a narrative level. Those reasons have to come from story things, and like you can dissect that movie and you can come to your own conclusion on whether or not you think it works in that story or it doesn't. And again, like it's important to remember that like when an adaptation, here's the thing. So like when we get something like Batman Year One, and it does things different than traditional Batman and other things, or I mean Earth One, not Year One. I meant Batman Earth One. So when you have like Batman Earth One, what's the difference between that being allowed? Because it's in comic book form, all right, whatever. But like, what's the difference between that being able to change things and then a movie being able to change things? And that's the thing that always irritates me is it's like it's an adaptation, no different than any other alternate universe thing that exists in comic books.
Right. No, I agree with you. I think a good place to take this though now would be: are there any cases within a work where you think an adaptation needs to alter it? Is there anything that you'd see that you read or watched or thing that you want to translate over and think that this is an aspect that we should definitely rework?
Oh, I don't know. Do you have any off the top of your head?
Like to think of adaptations as like corrective forces of like, this isn't a good story here, but if we put it somewhere else under a different pen, maybe it could be better. So like, is there anything like that you think like it's just on a conceptual level better because you altered this fundamental aspect of it?
I don't know. That's really tough. Like off the top of my head, I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I don't think Under the Red Hood or Civil War or anything like that is really a fair example, because even in those cases, they're not adapting it literally. There were changes being made because it's in a different continuity and such. But something that definitely needed changing. I think maybe one of the big things that the adaptation of Batman The Dark Knight Returns did that I like a little bit more than the comic is the loss of narration. And that's kind of debatable depending on who you are, but I think part of what made the book not age necessarily as well is that a lot of that narration is kind of overbearing, and a lot of the art is, I like the art in that book because I've just read it ever since I was a kid, but I think a lot of that could have worked better if the art was just doing a better job of conveying what was going on. I think Under the Red Hood, the movie, or not Red Hood, Dark Knight Returns, the movie, without the narration and with the cleaner animation style, is able to fix things about that, and so you're able to get the same message without Batman constantly monologuing to you about what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, and I don't know, like sometimes, like the weird thing about like narration is like sometimes we add narration to things. So like the movie like Victor Frankenstein.
Yeah.
That's a movie that like I've read the original script that Max Landis wrote for that, or the screenplay. It doesn't begin with narration, and as far as I know, there's no narration in the screenplay. But then like that movie begins with narration, and it's like, yeah, I was like, without a rewrite, it began with narration. That just shows you how much a script can change from like the from the screenwriter's original vision to what you see on the screen. Sometimes without even a rewrite, without anyone being credited as like the second writer on something, some things like that can change.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really strange because like that only made that movie less interesting because now everything is spelled out. Sometimes narration can almost be like a poetic thing. Like I love the beginning of Mad Max Fury Road.
Oh yeah.
I love that narration. And because it's more like poetic in a way. And that's a really strange thing. Matt Slaniker from Who Reviews the Reviewer season 4 just left a comment saying that in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the third act is very different from the comic, and apparently they used one of the author's original scrapped ideas for the ending in the ending of the movie.
That's really cool. I didn't know that. I really like that movie too.
I love that movie. But that's a really great example of like you get to do the other thing that you like that's cool. Like so you have your version of the story. Say it's like a graphic novel or whatever it is. Maybe it's animated, maybe it's a live action movie, and then you adapt it. And like if you thought long and hard about like how do I end this, and you have two cool ideas, one of the adaptations, you just do what you had planned in another version of the ending. That's a really cool thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think this is a good question to maybe talk about because the movie's about to come out. But that Dope Channel wants to know if The Killing Joke needed the additional Barbara Gordon story material that has reportedly been added to the animated film. We haven't seen the movie, so we can't say whether or not the movie needed it. But I think it's a good way to transition to the point that The Killing Joke exists within a comic book continuity. So things before the comic establish who Barbara Gordon is, and things after the comic expound on who she became after that story. The movie doesn't have that luxury. Regardless of how well that movie does, I really doubt we're going to put out another movie and make it a direct sequel to Killing Joke or a direct prequel to Killing Joke. So for the sake of adaptation, I think it's okay to add that material in, because if you don't, then you can't just assume people that are watching the movie as a movie are going to know who Barbara Gordon is.
Yeah, and it also kind of, I guess, matters on like what your intent is. So like you could come at that for the mindset of like, how do I like you can come at it from two different perspectives. Killing Joke is so cherished and so holy that if we're ever going to adapt it, we must adapt it page for page, word for word. That's one mindset. But then there's the other mindset of like, okay, well, we just literally do that. It's probably like if you just do the same thing in a different medium, it's probably not going to ever be on the same level in terms of interest or quality, because like I said, like the narrative was specifically, the medium impacted the way the narrative is told. So like it was tailor made to be in comic book panels. Then when you adapt it to animation, it wasn't like it was tailored to be that. So you're already making up some stuff because, you know, a comic is an image, an image, an image in sequential order. And then when you're in animation, you get to see the images in between those images. And so I think that already there, you can't really do the faithful adaptation right off the page. It makes more sense to just go ahead and do something different with it so that you can say it was worthwhile to adapt it. Also, that also comes down to purpose, because you're saying we're not just going to adapt exactly what's here. You're saying we're going to take what is here and make an adaptation of what was here. But it's a very different thing when you're saying like, I'm going to adapt this to screen versus saying like, let's do an adaptation of this. Like it's the same word, but it means something different, the way that the mindset that goes into creating that. So I kind of like the idea that they're adding stuff, because like I said, what is the purpose necessarily if you're just going to literally take something and put it on screen? It make it so that it definitively is better in the medium that you're telling it in.
Yeah, like if you're gonna have to. I think the first step in a lot of this is, and we'll get to this point later if we're just assuming live action, but I think the first step in a lot of this is you take the thing you want to adapt and you convert it into a screenplay, and then you see if as the text is just purely a screenplay, if just everything is literally translated word for word into a different format to match what a screenplay is written as, then what can you take out, and what can you put in, and what can you alter? So you really have to like shape the nature of the adaptation before you go anywhere. Like you can't just take a book and then like randomly take out text from it and turn that into the movie. You should probably turn that book into a screenplay and then go from like, okay, is this something that is better suited as a movie? And if we make it a movie, thinking about it from a visual perspective, what are things that we don't need anymore? And now to get more into this, but when people talk about adaptation, they're almost exclusively, like we are just now, talking about one medium going into live action. And I'm sure Geekvolution at some point sent a video about this weird need to like make everything justified in live action just because more people see it. But there were also cases of things going from a film to a TV show or to a comic book or to a book or things like that, like novelizations or adaptations. And so have you ever seen a case of like a movie being turned into something else and is better for it? Because the only example that comes off the top of my head right now is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was a Joss Whedon movie that he hated so much that he asked for his name off of the script, and then he went off and made the TV show, which everyone loves.
That's so some okay. Well, here's the thing. So like, this is kind of a different thing. This isn't the same thing because this isn't something that was like regarded as being horrible and then was adapted and then everyone loved it. It's something that was good in its own regard and people liked, but then when adapted became something much, much more. And to look at it almost without the adaptation, you kind of like slice it in half almost. And that's like Where the Wild Things Are. Mm-hmm. That's a movie that took a lot of ideas about like different kind of emotions and fears that you have as a kid. And they're all just like, they're not there necessarily in the book, but you can just look at that and it directly can be used almost like right off the page as just metaphor or allegory or something like that. And you can just like use that to make a really thematically interesting and deep film. And it's a strange thing where it's like, it's really hard to go look back at that now without projecting what you see about the movie onto the book.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's hard for me to go back and read the original Guns of Navarone book because I fell in love with the movie after I did the rewind on that. Mm-hmm. Like, there's just so many things about it. I'm like, clearly this is expanded on later. The Crow is also like that, where The Crow was written after the author went through all the traumatic stuff he writes about. And so the comic is nothing but this like pure expression of emotion. So it's a real tearjerker. It really tugs at your heartstrings, but it's not really a good story or a good character piece. It's just kind of a person going through therapy. And then the movie comes in and adds all this interesting story, character level to it, then makes that emotion work more. So that when you go back and read the comic, it's hard not to think about the stuff that was assumed or added into the movie.
Mm-hmm. Oh, someone just brought up Dragon Ball Evolution.
Oh God. Dragon Ball Evolution is to Dragon Ball Z fans what Last Airbender is to Avatar: The Last Airbender fans, but I think we got the worst end of the stick, mostly because, at least with Avatar, it was followed by another series. I don't really like Legend of Korra, but people love Legend of Korra. After Dragon Ball Evolution came out, we didn't really have anything for a while until Dragon Ball Super showed up, and even that's been very divisive against fans. So it feels almost like a franchise killer at that point.
Yeah. Somebody brought up Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs earlier too. That's a good one where they just took something and they completely did something new with it.
Yeah. And it works.
Yeah. That's a really good example. Oftentimes, like a lot of the best things are things where there is literally not a whole lot there, but it's just like visually interesting. So you can just like instantly take that and run with it. That's the case, like I said, with like Where the Wild Things Are, but that's also the case where like Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and stuff like that. Yeah,
no, that's a good point. Someone in the comments mentioned Godzilla. I think Godzilla is an interesting case because that went from being one movie into this weird epic media franchise, and so Godzilla is in everything. There are good comics, there's animated stuff, there's U.S. movies, there's Japanese movies, there are even books and stuff based on Godzilla, and I think it's always important to say that like just because something is being adapted and it permeates through different forms, it doesn't mean that any one medium that thing is in is definitive. So like Star Wars is all over the place with the expanded universe and such. That doesn't mean Star Wars is only good in movies, or Star Wars is only good in comics, or Star Wars is only good in books. It's all a matter of the nature of the story you tell. There's lots of stuff in expanded universe that I think is as good as Empire Strikes Back, and there are lots of things that are as bad as like Episode 2. Yeah. I still think Episode 2 is the worst Star Wars movie. That movie is so boring.
No, I agree. Episode 2 is my least favorite Star Wars movie as well. I hate that movie.
But yeah, like stuff like Star Wars, Godzilla, even like comic book characters in general, they permeate into so many versions that like they take on a life of their own. Where like animated Batman is its own area of adaptation. Live action Batman's its own area of adaptation. Comic book Batman's its own area of adaptation. We've done so many things and we've created so many things with a specific premise that there isn't one area of Batman or things like Godzilla that is definitive. Maybe Batman more so because it's always going to be a comic book, but I think you could say, I think you can give someone nothing but animated adaptations of Batman and turn them into a Batman fan, and it's not less legitimate than someone that's only seen movies or only read comics.
Yeah, that's the thing too, where like it's some things like Indiana Jones, it's hard to like, if you watch like everything but the original films, I don't know if you can really call yourself an Indiana Jones fan, but like with like comic books and Batman and stuff like that, that's definitely a case where there's so many different ways to like become a fan of it, where like you're getting the same thing that other people are getting. Like you're attaching yourself to the same things that someone attaches themselves to in the comic book. So like if you're watching animated series versus reading comics, you're still latching on to the same stuff. In a lot of the same cases, you're latching onto some of the same either themes or ideas or the world in itself. And so like that's a case where like you said, like you can watch like those movies and call yourself a fan of that character.
Yeah.
But you can't say that when everything else is like horrible. Like that's the case that, and there's some maybe decent Indiana Jones stuff, but there's a lot of like really stupid Indiana Jones stuff that's not the movies. So it's like, I don't know, like that's a harder sell, but you could make the argument for it. But like, yeah, like when there are various different versions that people have attached themselves to, that's a different thing where like you can call yourself a fan of Captain America by just liking the Captain America movies.
Yeah.
Regardless of if it is exactly off the page Captain America, that's still an adaptation of Captain America that is just as validated as like a comic book version of Captain America.
Yeah, I mean, when you create an adaptation that makes people think Captain America is better than Superman, then I think you've earned that right for that adaptation to be considered to some people definitive.
Yeah.
Chris Evans' Captain America I love. He's not really Captain America of the comics. Captain America of the comics is more gritty. He's more soldier-esque. But it's important that Chris Evans plays him differently, and it's important to the cultural zeitgeist that those movies came out at a certain point after we've had so many Superman DC movies to compare him to. And I love all the Captain America movies. They're all really, really good in their own right. And so they create fans in the same way that like other Batman movies create Batman fans. And it's not quite the same as like what you said with Indiana Jones, where like no one's really going to go out and read like the short stories of Indiana Jones and like become, oh my God, Indiana Jones is the greatest character of all time. They're usually going to go to the movies for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Someone brought that up. That's another, and that's kind of a strange one because we've had the adaptation of the book, then we have like this second adaptation of the book that's not really, it's weird because it is in a lot of ways trying to be a closer adaptation of the book, but then does things that it would only do because a first adaptation existed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's weird.
It's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is a weird thing where I think Willy Wonka is more true to the spirit of that book and the second one is more true to like the literal events of it.
Yeah.
But I would say the first Adaptations is still better because I think it understands that material better than the second one.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and check for comments. If there isn't anything more we need to talk about with this topic, we'll go ahead and move on to rants because we've been here for about 45 minutes. See if there's anything that we didn't bring up that people want us to bring up. Doctor Who is a weird thing because that is a definitively British thing that became more popular in America, but I think people would still consider it more British. Like you would never want to see an American Doctor, you just in the same way you never want to see an American James Bond.
Someone just brought up Apocalypse Now. I did not know that was an adaptation, if it is.
If it was, I've never read or seen the original, but I do know Apocalypse Now as it is, and I do like that movie.
I love Apocalypse Now.
That is one of those things where like I saw it once, and I remember it so vividly that I never feel the need to rewatch it.
Yeah, because I mean, it is one of those movies where it's really hard to forget anything that you see in it.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Do you see anything else that we should bring up?
World War Z. I never read that book, so
I hate movies, so I never went for the book.
Oh, Apocalypse Now is an adaptation of Heart of Darkness.
Okay, I might check that out then. See, maybe that's another thing to wrap up with of just like adaptations enticing you or not enticing you to pick up what the original thing is based on. There are lots of people that are going to watch Civil War the movie and think they should go back and read the Civil War comic, and they shouldn't because it's awful. And there are a lot of people that are going to watch something like Apocalypse Now, and after learning that it's an adaptation, we'll go out and seek out the material, just like I will now that I know it's based on something.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if that's about it, we'll go ahead and move on to rants, and then we'll do open forum. So, Rasco, what is your rant for tonight?
Okay, so last time I ranted about like stupid internet clickbait articles, so I'm gonna rant about that again. But this is a specific article that I saw. So I was like on the internet the other day, and I see this thing, and the article's name was, I think it was on the website Grunge or something like that, and it's like, why Daredevil Netflix needs to be recast. And I was like, what is this? And this article was published prior to Daredevil season 2, but there had been trailers for Daredevil season 2. So like, I just go and I see this article and I click on it, and these are the reasons why they say that Daredevil needs to be recast. So the first thing it says is that Foggy Nelson is too goofy, so he needs to be recast. So pretty much in the paragraph about that, it says, Foggy Nelson's great. He adds so much levity to the show, and he's much needed because of how dark and heavy some of the themes and ideas can be. It's great to have a lovable guy there all the time just to put a smile on your face. But he's too goofy, and he's just, you can't take him seriously, and he's stupid. I'm like, oh my God, I love Foggy Nelson in that show. So then we go on to Karen Page, and it goes, Karen Page is too nice. And I'm like, are you, what? She's too nice? And then it goes on to just praise Karen Page and say how great she is. And then it's like, but she's too nice to have a dark past. And I'm like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. Then we go on to The Punisher. And it's like, what was his name? Tom Burtonthal or something like that. It's like, he is backsliding into these tough macho guy roles where, you know, I want to see him get out of these roles where he has to be the tough guy all the time that goes around and beats people up. But I'm like, okay, you can say that, but I mean, like, what? He's so perfect for that role, and I don't think anyone comes out of Daredevil season 2 going, Punisher was a miss. That casting was a miss. Like, who thinks that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And then this was the worst one. It goes, Charlie Cox is too good. And then it goes on to say that, like, Charlie Cox is way too good to be in a show like this. His acting is so nuanced and phenomenal, yet the show is too cluttered and goofy comic book world and mythos to really take his performance seriously. And I'm just like, so your argument for why Foggy Nelson needed to be recast was that he's too goofy for such a dark and thematically deep show. But then your reason for why Matt Murdock should be recast is because the show is not dark and serious and gritty enough and doesn't have the amount of thematic depth for a caliber of actor like Charlie Cox. And I'm just like, what are you saying? You're both wrong. Like, it's absurd.
That's awful. Oh my God. I can't believe someone would publish that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awful. Okay. My rant is nowhere near as hilarious as that. It's over semantics, basically. Okay. So back in 2008, Matt Fraction started writing Iron Man, Invincible Iron Man. It was one of the first ongoings I picked up regularly. And I have almost all the issues of it, but at some point I was like, okay, I'm just going to buy this in trade because it's easier to sit down with like a thick tome than it is to like go back and like unpackage 15 issues for one story arc. So I figured out that Marvel was reprinting the run in like 20 issue chunks. And this was before Epic Collections were a thing. This is before we got 25 issues in a single paperback. And they released these things on Amazon called the Invincible Iron Man Omnibus. Now, if you know Marvel omnibuses, or omnibuy, whatever the word is, then you know they have a certain format. You know that on the spine of the omnibus, it'll write omnibus. And on the back of it, they'll show you all the covers of all the issues they collect. So this thing right here was sold as Invincible Iron Man Omnibus. And it is not a Marvel omnibus. It just isn't. And that's not really even the rant either. I was like, okay, whatever. You can sell it as whatever you want because people will just edit the names of it. So they released 2 of these, which collect the first 33 issues of Invincible Iron Man by Matt Fraction. And then they just stopped. And then they never solicited a single Volume 3 ever. And they did the same thing with Captain America, except with Captain America, they released the first 2. And then they waited like 5 years before they solicited the third one. And here's the thing with the rant, basically, it's just this. If you're going to release something as a series, give me some sort of schedule or let me know when it's canceled. I just had to assume for the longest time that Hulk Visionaries Peter David was just canceled, and then suddenly they put out an Epic Collection which picks up exactly where they left off, and they don't tell you that. You just know if you know that run's issue numbers that this is picking up on it. And then you look at something else like the way they released the Epic Collections for Iron Man by Dennis O'Neil. That's a run that goes from issue 158 to 208. And the story stops at 200. 200 is like the finale of that book, and then there are just 8 issues of kind of filler before the next writer takes over. Then they release 2 Epic Collections that stop at issue 195. So now you have to go in and buy the 3rd volume that you're only going to read for 5 issues, and they won't tell you when they're publishing the 3rd volume of it because they keep releasing these things randomly. I don't have a problem with you collecting things differently and then just stopping formats, but I need some consistency and I need some schedule. If you're going to publish 3 of these things, at least tell me what they're actually called and let me know when it's over, because I don't want to sit here waiting for like 5 years for volume 3 when I could just be buying up those singular hardcovers if you're not going to make a 3rd one. That's basically my rant.
Stop keeping
okay.
secrets. That's pretty much what your rant was. Just
Pretty
tell
much
us.
stop keeping secrets. Okay, we'll go ahead and go on to open forum for about 10 minutes. So go ahead and start posting your questions. We have some spare time tonight because it's just Rasco and I.
Somebody talked about Life is Strange. I don't know what that is, so.
That is an episodic video game, which is really good. I've only played through once. I want to go back and play it again and maybe do a video on it at some point. But it's kind of like a Telltale thing. Do you see any other questions?
Not sure.
Here's one from Mass Sci-Fi's fan asking us what we think of Tom Holland's selfie from the set of Spider-Man Homecoming, and I guess just Spider-Man Homecoming set photos in general. We talked a little bit about that last time, but every time I see a picture of that guy in costume, I love him as Spider-Man more and more.
Yeah, his costume looks awesome. I saw the set photos. I don't know the specific selfie that he's talking about, but I saw the set photos. They looked awesome. But then also they cast the girl who's from The Nice Guys.
Oh yeah, they did.
That's really interesting. I wonder who she'll be playing, but that's really cool because she's great in that movie.
She's one of my favorite parts of that movie. I'm glad that she's there. And the specific selfie is just something that they released a couple days ago, maybe, where he's in costume. He just takes a selfie, and it's marked that 1 year from today, Spider-Man: Homecoming's coming out, which is kind of exciting. Movies do this a lot now, where they just release something on their website or over Twitter that marks like a specific counter before the movie hits. But it's the best here because Spider-Man's whole thing is that he's been taking selfies before selfies were a thing, when he used to sell photos of himself to the Daily Bugle. So that's kind of awesome.
That's hilarious. Oh, that's so funny.
Okay, any other questions?
Somebody wanted us to talk about thoughts on Anna Kendrick wanting to play Squirrel Girl.
I guess that's cool. I don't really know anything about Squirrel Girl, but she's an actress I like a lot, so sure, if she's up for it.
I would prefer Mae Whitman play Squirrel Girl. I was really salty. Mae Whitman was the girl who she was in Scott Pilgrim versus the World. She was she was the president's daughter in the first Independence Day movie.
Yeah.
I want her, like, Mae Whitman's great in everything that I've ever seen her in. I want her to be freaking Squirrel Girl because she just like looks the part perfectly. Anna Kendrick is like really hot right now, so like I don't know if that really I don't know if that's gonna and like also I don't think it means anything when that's such like a clickbaity type of thing, like Anna Kendrick wants to play Squirrel Girl. Like you see that with I don't know who the actress, one of the actresses in Ghostbusters was like, like I saw this article, it's like so and so wants to be a Marvel villain, and I'm like that, and then I watched the video where she says this, and it's like, oh my god, like if you're titling your article so and so wants to play this, like you're obviously being disingenuous and acting as if it's like, because she said this, it might possibly happen. And it's just like, it's so irritating.
I really doubt Marvel's even thinking about making a Squirrel Girl movie right now. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah, strange.
Let's see if there are any other good questions.
Somebody wanted to know if we're going to see Ghostbusters. I am.
I don't really care about it, so unless one of my friends drags me to it, I'm probably not going to see it until it's like Netflix or DVD or something, unless people tell me it's amazing.
I just want to be able to go see it so that, like, if it's not bad and the internet bashes it, I can get mad at the internet. Like, if it is bad and everyone praises it, then, I mean, okay. But, I mean, like, this is all, like, opinions and stuff, but, like, I don't know. I have to go see that movie because I don't trust the public to accurately depict if that movie is good or bad.
Yeah, there's been so much like frustration, controversy, and reactionary stuff to it. Every review of it I have seen either says that it's exactly like you expected or it's nothing like you expected, and I don't want that. I just want a review that says, is it good objectively or is it bad objectively? Don't sit there and tell me that it's good or bad based on internet outrage.
Yeah. Here's a question that people want asked. This is from Red Leader Antilles. Can you guys get in on this debate? Does subjectivity supersede objectivity, or is it about balancing your personal views and objective views, forming your critical view? So I've got like a very strong rant on this.
Cool. Okay.
So, okay, when we talk about like art and in general, any sort of art, there is always a purpose behind art, okay? So if I set out to draw and I say, everybody, I'm going to do a photorealistic portrait of Steve Baxy's face, and then I do it and it looks like a shoe and it looks nothing like Steve Baxy's face, then I failed at doing what I was trying to do. But regardless of whether or not I failed at what I was trying to do, that doesn't mean that you cannot like what I did. You might look at the portrait of the shoe face and say, this is great, I love it. But to say that it is a good drawing of Steve Baxy's face is where it kind of becomes a little bit disingenuous. So I think that it is impossible to be entirely objective. It is possible to be entirely subjective, though. But I think that it's about taking your subjective opinions and you kind of focus those through like a filter or a lens of objectivity, where you are able to point out, is what I'm saying a issue with the movie or a taste issue with the movie that I personally have? And it's about looking through this lens of objectivity, not necessarily saying I am a robot who has no personal preference and I'm just going to look at a movie. Like you may see a movie that everyone says is great, and maybe you don't have an argument for why it's bad, but you still might not like it, and that's fine. It's almost two different debates. Is it good, and what does it succeed at doing, and do I like it? So it's, in a way, it's like three different debates that people conflate into one.
Yeah, no, that's a definitely great way to answer it. It's something like, for example, someone can say that they don't like the Mandarin twist in Iron Man 3. I guess we're just going to that because Adaptations tonight. But you can say you don't like it, and subjectively, that's fine. You don't have to like it. But objectively, you cannot make the case that it doesn't work within the context of the film, because it absolutely does. So part of the problem with this debate is people don't actually seem to understand what the words objective and subjective mean and where they come from, because what a lot of people seem to think is that objective just means fact and subjective just means personal opinion, and that's not really what those words are. First of all, facts are not concrete. Facts are things that always evolve and change, and even if you read a fact, you are interpreting that fact through your subjective lens. So ever since objective subjective became an issue in like the 1700s because of Immanuel Kant, ever since that became a thing, everyone has sort of started to agree with this notion that objectivity and subjectivity are two things that are mixed and you cannot split them up, that you will always have to filter things that are seen as objective through a subjective lens, and you will always attempt to take something that is subjective and try and make it seem more objective. You can, the basic way to put it for art really is that you can say something is good or bad objectively because it adheres to a certain principle, whatever that principle may be, that everyone can agree to. But subjectively, you don't have to agree with that. You can look at a painting and say this is a good painting, but you don't have to like it. Spider-Man 3 Spider-Man 2 is a really, really good movie. I don't like it though. Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a bad movie, but I really like it. It's that kind of thing. So you have to be able to, like, when you're making these arguments and you're making these debates, you have to know what these words mean. You can't make a critical, objective review of something that is nothing but personal preference. And you can't make an argument of personal preference based on nothing but like objective facts about it. Like, you can't say that you have to like this thing because it does this thing about stories that are good. No, you don't have to. It's a matter of like being able to understand what is critical and what is subjective. And this is an area where I don't think there is much of a debate. That's just what these words mean. If you don't agree with that dissection of what objective and subjective are, then you need to just go back and read what the history of the terms objective and subjective are, because that's what they mean. They mean how you filter experiences. And so how you balance them is your own business, but that's what they are. They are a balancing act. They've always been a balancing act.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
Matt Slaniker says Pokemon Go is causing trouble and stuff. I actually follow the Pokemon games and haven't played it. Do you guys? I've played tons of Pokemon, but I have not played Pokemon Go.
I started playing Pokemon Go a couple of days ago. I haven't gotten the chance to go out and like walk around much just because it's been raining and stuff here lately. But I have been playing it and I'm really enjoying it. It's a lot of fun. The biggest issue people need to worry about with that game right now is it kills a lot of battery and it uses up a lot of data. So if at all possible, bring some kind of portable charger, or like try and bounce from Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi, or you're going to run up with an insane bill at the end of the month.
Be a Wi-Fi moocher and just mooch
exactly.
Wi-Fi. That's hilarious.
Let's go ahead and do one more and then we'll wrap up.
Jacob may have, this is from Jacob. He says, have you guys seen the show Danny Phantom? If you haven't, the show is basically Spider-Man mixed with Ghostbusters, and it's awesome. I have seen that show. I was actually almost at one point about to bring that up as like something that you could adapt that could be really cool.
Cool.
Because like the effects of that would be really interesting to see, like someone who can like turn into a ghost, stuff like that would be really cool. So I don't know, that could be a really cool movie. I just kind of casually saw episodes of it every now and then when I was a lot younger. So I don't know.
I've never finished the show. I know there's a finale, and I know that it's like this weird, like big phase the Earth through like an oncoming asteroid. Everyone's happy at the end, kind of ending. And I've never seen that. I just know that's what happens. But aside from that, I really like the show. I think it's a lot of fun. It makes fun of comic book things. It makes fun of secret identity things. It's really entertaining, and I've always thought the idea of ghost powers was really cool, and I love his costume, particularly when he got like the weird D symbol on his chest. So I like that show. At some point I might go back to it if it's on like Netflix or something, but I haven't seen it readily available anywhere.
It had a great theme song.
They did. It had a fantastic theme song. It had a great art style too. It's the same guy that does Fairly Odd Parents, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's going to be it for us tonight. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks for watching live. We'll be back next week to do another GNN topic. Hopefully, Captain Logan will be back by then. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and this has been Rasco.
Howdy, everybody. Peace out.
And I will see you, everyone, next time. Oh, I will mention, though, coming up next week, Eric's going to keep uploading more Transformers commentaries. And he and I tomorrow night are going to record our second Vampire Hunter D commentary, and that should be up around Tuesday. A Dragon Ball Super episode should be up around Tuesday or Wednesday. So there are more videos coming. So keep a lookout for all of that good stuff. And the Spy Movie Rewind I'm actually working on right now. So you should probably get that either at the end of the month or the start of August. But again, thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you next time.